Okay, having done that, we have done our first steps. We have set up our gender equality hub, our map factors. We have more or less clear what's going to be the road. So we should go into our second step, which is focused on assessing the state of play of the institution. Okay, so the first decision is, what are we going to assess here? What are we going to analyze here so we can properly identify the problems and inequalities in our institution? So, the first thing would be the data collection and analysis. This is our starting point. That would be asking this question: which data need to be collected under the three basic domains of a gender equality plan, which, as you remember, the three basic domains are related to these gender equality objectives of the European Commission and the EAR roadmap, which is gender equality among researchers, gender equality in decision-making, and gender dimension in research. Okay, it's these three, but of course, these three domains can be broken down into other specific areas. And then we also have some cross-cutting issues that we should not forget about, like, for example, working on gender stereotypes or working on sexual and sexist harassment, which would be, as I was saying, cross-cutting, okay? And also remember what we saw our first day, that when we talked about the areas of intervention of our institutional process, that you had a list of 5 of them, like things like reconciliation of work and private life, work-life balance, things like, of course, recruitment and selection and careers progression, leadership and decision-making, and all those. So we can broke down these 3 areas into those specific areas of intervention. So, how do we proceed then from here? First step, we need to identify all type of data that you need to collect. Okay, saying that we need sex disaggregated data about all type of staff and all type of students. Also, we're talking about the whole community of our organization, so we can identify gender imbalances and we can identify underrepresented areas or specific pressing areas that will require intervention, right? So one practical tip here is that we might find out, it happens many times, that we have not sex disaggregated data in our institution, that it is not systematically collected. So the key question that we need to be asking here is, which data are already available? Okay, which data is easy to get, and go for that. And then also take into account that we need to think in both quantitative and also qualitative terms here, okay? It's, you know, quantitative data, they only reveal like a tip of the iceberg, but there are, and with that, of course, we can identify some symptomatic inequalities, but we need qualitative data to really identify those more hidden and endemic gender inequalities there, okay? Then we need to identify possible sources of information and techniques to collect data. So we need to ask, where can we find this information and who are we going to ask for it? And these, they should be part of our map of factors, right? Then we need to, of course, review our relevant framework of legislation and policies in our countries, but also in our institution, because sometimes it will just provide the rationale to support our actions. And then we need to collect, to analyze that data. And here, remember the holistic approach. The analysis should be as comprehensive as possible, and it should include identifying also existing measures and existing resources and so on, so we can think how to link them with new measures or how we can enhance their effectiveness and so on, okay? Okay, so one important thing of this step is that many times preliminary assessment do not provide like a real in-depth analysis, but they just provide some specific isolated, like key figures on some specific areas or some sector issues on different like academic positions or things like that, while a proper in-depth study that tackle fundamental issues like access to decision-making, like gender in research content and so on, they remain untackled, okay? So please be clear that we need to design a preliminary assessment as thorough, as exhaustive as possible, okay? Also being realistic and knowing what are the data that we can count on and so on, okay? It will, of course, depend on the available resources, but keep that in mind. So how do we collect that data, okay? There is a list of possible techniques here. This is a non-exhaustive list, okay? You can add any other techniques you want in the chat box so we can complete the and feed the list. But it includes some interesting tools to conduct our assessments, like, for example, checking administrative data, doing interviews and doing focus groups, doing questionnaires, of course, then workshops, in which is highly recommended to use creative participatory tools and techniques here, okay? A course diagram, I will show you an example of this now. Of course, the stakeholders or the actors mapping, as we just did, then the SWOT analysis. I'm sure that you know this one, but just in case, this SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So this is an analysis that to assess these 4 aspects of our institution regarding gender equality. Then observation, of course, because just, you know, listening and observing will contribute to add like a more human or more empathic dimension to our analytical approach. Then we can use also diaries or benchmark, which we use for inspiration, okay? Benchmarking is this process of where we measure the performance of one institution activities or processes against those of another institution. That is considered to be a good example, but we just use this for inspiration, okay? And the example I wanted to bring here is the cost diagram. As you can see, we use this template to analyze a specific problem, right? Imagine that we use the problems that you identified the first session, where I ask, what is the most urgent, the most important problem to be tackled at your institution? So think that you have each of those problems just written in one sticky notes, so we can work with each of those problems. So first, we have to look at that problem. We place it in the center of the circle here, okay? And then we should identify the direct causes. So we place that in the next level. What are the direct causes affecting or causing this? What is causing in our institution this problem? Then we identify the indirect causes that are affecting. That would be like, what is the cause or the direct cause, something like that, right? And then in the outer circle, we place the contributing factors, the contributing causes, like those structural aspects, okay, that are influencing our problem. Okay, so then we can think of specific measures for each level, right? There are, of course, many other possible techniques. Please share them. If you have used any technique that has been successfully used for you, just drop them in the chat box, okay? So we can complete the list. But I think you have quite a lot here already. Okay, so once we have our data, what is the next step? We have here like the whole process. We have talked about the data collection, where we identify data and we identify sources of information. And then what we should do is that we apply our data collection techniques and we develop our baseline, okay, which is going to be our tool that will help us do the monitoring of results, which will give us a picture of our starting point and how to monitor and evaluate it later. Then, second step, we need to do the data analysis, okay, to identify the differences and inequalities between women and men in our institution. And for doing this data analysis, what we do is that we triangulate the information, okay? This triangulation, this is, it sounds a little bit, but this is just what we do. When we use more than one technique, as we were saying, if we're using questionnaires and focus groups and participatory methods, and, different methodologies, then triangulation is what we do. To develop a more comprehensive understanding of the issue that we are analyzing, which not necessarily mean just to cross-check data and put it one against the other just to confirm if one thing is correct or not. It's not about that, okay? It's just about to increase the level of knowledge about something, looking at it from different perspectives and with different methods, and that's it. So it's like gaining insights on an issue, okay? And then, of course, we extract results here. And with all these analysis, we translate that into insights. And we define with that, for our context, what is the right problem or the right opportunity, okay? And to define these, the participatory techniques can definitely help in this work. So as you see, there is a lot to care about for proper gender analysis here. So take into account that this can be really challenging and this can be really time consuming, much more than expected. So a practical tip here would be to plan this step, to plan a little bit more time for this step, okay, than what you might initially think that it will take. Because then it's not that easy to get data and, to get people involved in the different techniques. And so, yeah, take that into account.